My name is Nikki Malley, and you may remember me from the last school tour when I was leading this group playing that funny-looking instrument, the vibraphone. This year, we weren't able to come visit you in person, so we are visiting you over the internet to keep everyone safe. But we hope you find it to be just as fun and inspiring as in the past. The Rootabaga Jazz Festival will be on April 16th and 17th with two wonderful groups. There will be a small audience allowed at the beautiful Orpheum Theater for every show, so you can contact the Orpheum Theater to get your tickets. Also, this will be the first year that the whole festival will be live streamed on the Knox College YouTube channel, so you can watch all the concerts wherever you are. Soul Message, a great organ quartet from Chicago, will be performing Friday night and Saturday morning for our Rootabaga Kids program. And many of you will remember alto saxophonist Greg Ward, who led this school tour a few years ago. He will be performing with his group, Rogue Parade, on Saturday nights. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the incredible trumpeter, Tito Carrillo, who will be presenting a brief history of jazz for this year's Rootabaga School Tour. He'll be joined by Whitney Ash on piano, Jason Brannon on the drums, and Andy Crawford on the bass. I hope you all enjoyed today's program, and we look forward to seeing you in person next year at the 2022 School Tour with the wonderful Matt Wilson.
The purpose of these videos is to give you a glimpse of the rich legacy and history of America's original art form known as jazz. I say original art form because jazz was created and invented right here in the United States of America and has influenced virtually every form of American music ever since and has expanded its reach all over the world over the last 100 years. Our story begins in a town that was known as a melting pot, where people and cultures from all around came to live and mingle with one another. The town is New Orleans, Louisiana, and here you'll find whites, blacks, French, Spanish, and Caribbean islanders, all who brought elements of their cultures with them, including their food and their music. It's Sunday, which is the one day that years ago slaves were free to meet over at Congo Square to practice traditions that they brought over from Africa, like the playing of the drums, songs, worship, and dance. This is where it all started and where it all came together. The sound of the blues. The rhythm of swing, and the creativity of making up music on the spot, which is what we call improvisation. What really is improvisation? It's when you take a song people know well, and you add the sound of the blues and an extra helping of swing to make the song your own. This all began in New Orleans, the birthplace of jazz. The jazz bands in New Orleans around this time consisted of cornet, or trumpet, which would play the lead or the melody. The other horns in the front line were the clarinet, which is a long black instrument from the woodwind family that plays a lot of fast notes, and the trombone, a member of the brass family with a long slide that could bend notes. The New Orleans trombone style was known as the tailgate trombone. You've probably heard them bend notes in a raucous manner like this. They used to bend those notes whenever they felt like it, and they often felt like it. The rest of the group consisted of piano, banjo, and usually a tuba to play the bass line, primarily because a lot of musical events consisted of outdoor parades and marches. But the bass line could also be played by the upright double bass. The percussion often included a very simple collection of a bass drum and some cymbals, which created a sort of street beat feel. Now, one of the first big names in jazz was Joe King Oliver. King Oliver was a cornetist from New Orleans, whose bands began to travel the country, bringing his soulful brand of hot New Orleans music. One of his early hits from 1923 was called Dippermouth Blues, where King Oliver used the rubber tip of a plunger as a mute for his trumpet and gave his horn a soulful, bluesy vocal quality. In the early 1920s, he moved up to Chicago, which had become the center of the jazz universe at that time, and he helped a lot of young New Orleans musicians professionally by inviting them to move to Chicago and play with his band. One of his young protégés on the trumpet was a young man named Louis Armstrong. King Oliver immediately noticed the incredible talent and his huge, fat trumpet tone. In fact, back then, when they would record, they would have one microphone in the middle of the room, and the band would get in a circle. Well, Louis Armstrong's tone was so strong, they would have to put him outside of the room down the hallway in order for him not to overwhelm the rest of the band. But in addition to his amazing sound was his dazzling technique, his incredible sense of swing, and his genius-level creativity. He just sounded different from everybody else. On one occasion, he played a trumpet intro to the song West End Blues. That was the first jazz cadenza the world had ever heard. We're going to play that for you right now, and joining me in this selection is Whitney on piano, Andy on the bass, and Jason on the drums. And after I play the West End Blues intro, we're going to go into one of the most famous New Orleans compositions, When the Saints Go Marching In. Louis Armstrong, who also went by the nickname Satchmo and Pops, went on to become the very first international jazz superstar. His imprint on jazz and on American music cannot be overstated. No one helped to spread the popularity of jazz throughout the country and the world like Pops. Now it's time to turn our attention to the 1930s and New York City, which quickly had taken over New Orleans and Chicago as the jazz capital of the world. But they had a different flavor than New Orleans' style of hot music. Instead of one trumpet, they expanded the section to include 3 or 4. They did the same thing with the trombones, and instead of having just a clarinet player, they expanded it into a section of saxophones. The tuba was replaced by the double bass full time now, and instead of the 2-beat feel, rum, bum, 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 now the bass would swing, playing a consistent line of quarter notes, which came to be known as a walking bass line. The banjo was replaced by the piano full time, and this new large group was able to put out a powerful sound that could supercharge any dance hall. This period came to be known as the big band swing era of the 1930s and 40s, and some of the best-known bands were led by Benny Goodman, Count Basie, Glenn Miller, and Tommy Dorsey. One of the most famous band leaders and most important American composers was a piano player from Washington, D.C. named Edward Kennedy Ellington, affectionately known as Duke. The Duke Ellington Orchestra had a long engagement at the Cotton Club in Harlem, where they would play nightly for adoring fans and ecstatic dancers. Here's one of their biggest hits, entitled, "It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing." Hey, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Do-wop, 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 do-wop. It don't mean a thing, all you got to do is sing. Do-wop, 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 do-wop. It makes no difference if it's sweet or hot. Just give that rhythm everything you got. It don't mean a thing, all you got to do is sing. Do-wop, 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 do-wop. The swing era is when jazz reached the absolute height of popularity in America, propelled by a dance craze known as the Lindy Hop, also known as the jitterbug, which would have dancers attempting acrobatic feats that defied gravity, lifting their partners through the air and down through their legs, and incorporating fast jumps, turns, and twirls, none of which will be demonstrated for you here. But out of the swing era emerged an outstanding group of jazz soloists who wanted to do more than just play music for dancing. They wanted to focus more on improvisation and write new and original compositions and put on concerts for listening audiences. So after their dance band gigs, they would head over to Minton's Playhouse up in Harlem for some epic jam sessions where musicians, young and old, would come together to prove themselves on the bandstand. Out of these sessions emerged a young crop of jazz artists with interesting nicknames like Bird and Dizzy and Monk, and they played a brand of music that sounded completely different than the older generations. This new music came to be known as bebop, and it was fiery, flamboyant, and fast. Here's a composition called Wail by bebop piano master Bud Powell. Bebop is quite complex, but it sure is a lot of fun. Did you notice at the end of that selection, we had a moment of trading fours, where I would improvise for 4 measures, and then the drums would respond, and then piano would play for 4 measures, and then the drums would improvise for 4 measures. And it's like we're having a conversation back and forth. And that level of spontaneity and dialogue is what makes this music so exciting. Now, along with Bud Powell, saxophonist Charlie Parker, also known as Bird, and trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie led the bebop revolution and changed the course of jazz forever. From then on, it would become a music for the concert hall and listening rooms all around the world. From the bebop world, there were a handful of musicians who wanted to expand their music and combine it with music from other cultures around the world. One of the first to do this was the great trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie. Even though he co-led the bebop revolution, a friend named Mario Bauza turned him on to some great Cuban music that had been happening in New York at the time. And Dizzy was fascinated with these new rhythms. He wanted to see if they could be combined with bebop and form a new style of music. In 1947, he was introduced to Cuban percussionist Chano Pozo, and the two composed music together that did just that. And we now know this style as Latin jazz. Here is one of their biggest hits called Manteca. Since the 1950s, jazz has gone on to take on many forms and has been combined with musical styles all over the world, from places like Brazil, Israel, and Asian countries such as Japan. Jazz music is truly a shape-shifting art form, able to be fused and twisted and joined with virtually any other style. Yes, there are certain rules that every jazz artist must comply with: the ability to swing, the ability to play the blues, and to be able to improvise over complex chords and harmonies. But ultimately, the magic of this music is that it celebrates the individual, even while working within a group. Jazz is all about expressing yourself, your own thoughts, your feelings, your whole self. It's about expressing your passion and your dreams through musical sound. That's actually what drew me into jazz in the first place. I started playing trumpet when I was 11, And I remember seeing a guy on the Grammys playing a classical cornet solo, then turning right around and playing an incredible jazz piece. His name was Wynton Marsalis, and I began buying his albums and following his music. Back then, we bought something known as CDs, or compact discs, and they would come with liner notes that spoke about the music. Wynton would keep mentioning these other names like Sonny Rollins and Thelonious Monk and Clifford Brown and Miles Davis. So I began my own investigation into jazz, partly by going to my public library to check out jazz albums, and partly by spending whatever money I had on CDs. I would lock myself into a room and listen to each record over and over again, trying to understand what they were doing and why they sounded so great. I also had friends who liked jazz, and whenever one of them would get a new album, we'd go over that person's house and listen to it together. I didn't know it at the time, but I was practicing deep listening, which is different than just turning on music in the background while you do something else. Deep listening is when you listen for the purpose of study, trying to get inside the mind of these great artists and imagining that they were playing live for you in your own living room. The more I listened, the more excited I was to practice and get better, so that hopefully one day I could play like my heroes. But I found myself playing more classical music because that came a little easier to me, and I had a really hard time figuring out exactly how to practice improvisation. I mean, how do you get good at making stuff up? I decided to study classical trumpet when I got to college, but I always loved listening and playing jazz. I was just simply frustrated that I couldn't seem to learn how to do it. It was at that time that I met my first great jazz teacher named Willie Thomas. Willie Thomas was an incredible trumpet player, a great teacher, albeit a tough teacher. And he was the person who helped decipher the mysteries of improvisation for me. He told me that we were going to learn only a handful of standard jazz tunes, and those tunes were all we were going to be practicing for an entire summer. Then he gave me some ideas to learn, small bits and pieces of jazz vocabulary. He told me that all of the greats play these ideas and use them in their solos. Deep down, I didn't really think this would work for me, but I was desperate to learn how to improvise, so I practiced those ideas really hard and learned them very well. By repeating those ideas over and over again, an amazing thing started happening. I started hearing those same ideas in my favorite players, but they had these souped-up, turbocharged versions. So I began replacing the simple ideas my teacher had taught me with these more complex ideas I was listening to, because for the first time in my life, I could hear them. After that, my jazz solos started taking off, and I caught the jazz bug hard. After graduating college, I moved to Chicago, and I became a full-time trumpet player, playing all kinds of styles, but especially focusing on jazz. I played a ton of gigs and started teaching and sharing what I knew with younger musicians and students. After 10 years of living and playing in Chicago, I became a full-time jazz trumpet professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where I've been for the past 14 years. My advice for young students who are thinking about a career in music is this: whatever you're doing right now has a direct impact on the options that will be available to you in your future career. Now, I was someone who actually liked to practice and was driven by my passion for trying to sound like my heroes, both in classical music and in jazz. My parents never really had to tell me to practice. I also had some amazing teachers who pushed me, but saw something in me that motivated me to keep going and keep moving forward in music. To be honest, I didn't really know what a career in music would look like, since I didn't know anybody who did that for a living. I just focused on building my strengths and attacking my weaknesses. And I felt that when the opportunities started coming my way to perform years later, I was ready enough for those moments. The other thing I want to say is don't forget that the music industry is quite large, and there are many avenues to create a career that may look very different than mine. There's composition, arranging, recording engineering, and of course putting together your own groups and writing your own music for whatever style, whether it's pop, rock and roll, hip hop, or whatever you like. Everybody's career looks a little bit different in music. Sure, there's a lot of competition, no doubt, but remember that there's only one you. So if you're passionate about doing this and willing to work at it in order to put out your best musical product into the world, then I say, go for it. One thing this pandemic has taught each of us is how important music is to our lives. And I'm 100% confident it's all going to come back once we're past this. We're going to be seeing and playing live music again. So if that's something you want to do, be ready for when the opportunity arrives. I want to thank you for watching this Walk Through Jazz History video performance. I would like to thank the members of the band, Whitney on piano, Andy on the bass, and Jason on the drums. I would also like to thank the Rootabaga Jazz Festival, Andy Crawford, and all of the staff that have helped here at Knox College for inviting me to be a part of this project. And I want to leave you now with one of my compositions where I get to express myself a little bit. I am a Latino American who loves jazz and loves Latin rhythms, and you'll be able to hear both of those elements in this tune that I call Truth Seeker. Enjoy.